So, welcome to my talk on Agile product roadmaps. I intend to speak for about 40-45 minutes and would like to encourage you to use the chat in order to ask questions and share your perspectives and experiences. And I'd suggest that once I've guided you through the slides, the material that I've prepared, I'll try and answer as many questions as I can. Good. So there are two things I'd like to do in my session, in my talk. The first one is to make sure we have a shared understanding of what a product roadmap is. And then the second thing I'd like to do is to share some tips, some practices that I found helpful to apply product roadmaps effectively in an agile context. So what is a product roadmap? Well, I don't know about you, but in this part of the world where I live, in the UK, just outside London, it's getting darker and wetter and colder day by day, and so it feels right to think ahead a little bit and plan the next holiday, maybe a spring or early summer holiday, maybe somewhere nice and warm, maybe at a beach, where we can chill and relax. Now, if I wanted to go to a beach somewhere nice in Europe and take the family, go on a family vacation, a family holiday, then maybe southern France would be a good destination. And there's a nice little place near the border to Spain called Agile. Now, if that's where I'd like to go, then it feels natural to consider how can I get there. And assuming that I want to travel there by car and go on a road trip, it probably would be useful to think about how do I get from the UK, from England to France? Should I take the ferry or should I take the train, the shuttle? And then should we drive via Paris or Lyon? Which motorways should we use? And should we use motorways? It's a long journey. It's nearly 14 hours driving time. It might make sense to break it up with the kids in the back of the car. So should I maybe pre-book a hotel? And even if we don't stay overnight, are there any good stopover points to take longer breaks and recuperate a little bit, have something to eat and drink? So that's what I'd do in order to plan out a road trip. I'd get out a traditional paper map or use Google Maps as you can see here in this case. And anticipate the key events, the key milestones. And so I suggest that you do the same thing for your product, that you plan ahead as far as you can, and you think about the journey you'd like to take your product on. And that's exactly what a product roadmap wants to help you do. So a product roadmap really is just an actionable product plan that communicates, that shows how your product is likely to evolve. And it typically covers several major releases or product versions. And by a major release, I mean something that makes a difference to the users, where you typically bundle new features or feature updates and then release it in one go. Think about something like Windows 10 or iOS 10 or 10.1. You can still happily use continuous delivery, deployment of course, and still use a product roadmap. Good, so roadmaps, I like using roadmaps. I think they're useful tools for product people, for product managers, product owners and others in charge of products, as they provide several benefits. The first benefit I'd like to draw your attention to is that a roadmap provides a continuity of purpose. If you just think from release to release, if you just think in 3 months, 2 months, 6 months cycles, then sometimes that can be a little bit short-sighted. And a product roadmap that maybe covers the next 12 months allows us to sketch out how the product is likely to grow and develop, and thereby provides a longer-term outlook. It describes the big picture. I find that useful. And it's useful because it facilitates stakeholder collaboration. It makes it easier for the stakeholders to anticipate what they need to do in order to help make those releases a success, how their work is influenced. For instance, if marketing has to adjust the marketing strategy, or if the salespeople have to create new sales collateral. It provides a high-level overview to the stakeholders how the product is likely to grow, and is often more useful, I find, than the product backlog in that sense, as the product backlog often is too detailed and there's too much change. It helps with prioritization. If somebody comes to you and says, well, this will be a great feature that we should definitely do, but there's no way it fits into the current release, the current project, then the roadmap helps you to contextualize it and say, well, is there a future release where this feature could help with? And talking about the product backlog, I feel when applied correctly, the product roadmap unburdens the product backlog. It helps you work with a more focused and concise backlog. And I'll talk more about the relationship between the product backlog and the roadmap in a few minutes. It helps you acquire a budget. If you're in a position that you have to justify the investment that goes into your product, then a product roadmap can be useful, as it allows you to describe the benefits that your product is likely to deliver over the next 12 months or so. And finally, it supports portfolio management. If your product is part of a portfolio, a group of related products, sometimes also referred to as a product family, then a roadmap can help you identify and manage dependencies between the individual products, and that can be very helpful. So again, generally I find product roadmaps are helpful tools. However, any tool is only helpful if we apply it effectively, if we apply it properly, and particularly in an agile setting, which is characterized by change and uncertainty and risk and innovation. I think we need to apply product roadmaps carefully and wisely. So, here are my product roadmapping tips. And the first suggestion is to focus on goals, not on features. So I find, again, when you're in an agile context, there's uncertainty, there's risk, there's change, then it's very beneficial to start with the goals, the desired benefits that your product should deliver over the coming months, and not focus primarily on the features, the deliverables, the product capabilities. And this means working with a goal-oriented roadmap, sometimes also referred to as a theme-based roadmap. Basically the same thing as far as I'm concerned. Now, I'm going to show you now a template that I've developed in order to capture goal-oriented roadmaps, but it's not about the template, it's not about ticking some boxes or filling out the structure. It's really just to illustrate the point of how important goals are or can be when you do road mapping in an agile context. So goal-oriented roadmaps are all about goals. These are the reason for creating a release, a major release, and they should describe the benefit that the release provides. And every goal should essentially answer a why question. Why is it worthwhile developing this release, spending time, money, and energy on getting this release out? Is it maybe to acquire new customers? Is it maybe to retain existing customers? Is it maybe to future-proof the product by removing technical debt and carrying out some architecture refactoring? What is it? What is the benefit? Is it to reduce cost? Is it to generate more revenue? So this is where I would start, generally speaking, when you do road mapping in an agile space. Think about the journey ahead of your product, think about some milestones, and think about the benefits that your product should provide, the goals that you'd like to achieve with your product. And then take another step. Take another step, shows you how well I know my slides. And think about dates and timeframes. So, this little section here in this specific template is there to allow you to capture the release date or timeframe. I personally like using dates and timeframes on my roadmaps, certainly on an internal roadmap, which really is there to help the product person, the product manager, product owner, the development team, and the internal stakeholders understand how is the product likely to evolve and develop. If you work with an external roadmap that has more a sales focus and is there to instill some trust in the marketplace, the customers, that you've got some great ideas in the pipelines and that you're truly committed to developing this product in the future, you may want to be a little bit careful and certainly not show specific dates, but maybe only some loose timeframes and say, well, we're talking now here about a release maybe in the first half of the next year or the second half of the next year and so forth. And often, as you probably know, there is a trade-off between adhering to a date or a certain time frame and fully meeting a goal. And I find that those trade-off discussions and decisions are very important and valuable. So do consider what is more important, fully meeting a goal and, for instance, acquiring a certain amount of new users or addressing a new market segment, or doing it within a specific date or time frame. Release has become available. Yeah. Or if we talk about removing technical debt and future-proofing the product, then maybe there's a certain area in the code base that we want to clean up and improve. Maybe there's a certain complexity threshold that we do not want to exceed. And again, it'd be worthwhile to state those metrics so there's clarity what it means to achieve the goal, what it takes to achieve the goal, and the goal becomes measurable. I mean, generally speaking, I'd say your goals on the product roadmap should be smart, they should be specific, they should be measurable, agreed upon, and they should be actionable. Yeah. There are two more elements on the next one are the features. Those are the capabilities, high-level product capabilities or deliverables necessary to meet the goal. But I would really encourage you to first think about the goal and the benefit, and then ask yourselves, now in order to meet this goal, what are the features that we have to put in place, or which features do we have to improve and maybe change? Yeah. So the goal comes first, the features come second. And the last element here is rather boring, I guess. It's just there so you can give your releases a nice, cool name. Yeah. So if this template resonates with you, then go and download it from my website. But again, it's not about the template. It's not about filling out some forms, pushing some paper. This was really there to encourage you to think about the benefits of the major releases and the benefits that your product should deliver over the coming months, and state those first and clearly. So that was my first recommendation. The second recommendation is about the relationship between the product roadmap and the product backlog. And my preference is to start with the product roadmap, start with the big picture, and then work on the details, derive the product backlog from the roadmap. So here's our shiny new product roadmap, and here is our product backlog. And just to remind you, the product roadmap is a strategic product plan, a high-level plan that describes how the product is likely to grow across several product releases. The product backlog, however, I would say is a tactical tool. It covers the details that are necessary in order to deliver the product, such as epics and user stories, but maybe also UI sketches, maybe some interaction diagram, workflow diagrams, depending on what's important to your product. And it may cover one or more releases. Now, if you follow my advice, you'd do the product roadmap first, and then you'd look at your goals and you'd look at the high-level features on your product roadmap and ask yourself, now, in order to maybe meet those goals, maybe only in order to meet the next goal, what is necessary? What are the epics that we can identify right now? And you'd add them to the product backlog. So I quite like to focus the product backlog on the next major release. And I like to use the release goal to scope the product backlog. The benefit of that is that you end up with a concise product backlog that is comparatively easy to manage, comparatively easy to update and adjust. Particularly if your product is young, or if you're making bigger changes to an existing product. So if there's a lot of uncertainty and change, having a long detailed product backlog is very difficult to cope with, because making the necessary changes to the product backlog, incorporating the learnings, the insights generated from exposing product increments to selected users and customers becomes very difficult and very expensive. So whenever there's lots of change, whenever there's lots of innovation and risk, you do want to work with a concise, focused product backlog. And by limiting the backlog on the next release and covering the development of future releases in the product roadmap, you can do this fairly neatly. However, do be aware that when you use those two tools, you have to keep them in sync. And it's not only that the product roadmap guides the product backlog, it can also be that bigger product backlog changes lead to product roadmap adjustments. So for instance, if the development progress is slower than anticipated, then you may have to adjust your product roadmap. Or if the feedback on one of the early product increments suggests that you cannot achieve achieve the goal, the release goal, or maybe that the release goal is wrong, right? Then again, you may have to adjust the roadmap. So I do think those two things, those two tools, planning artifacts, complement each other nicely, but you got to keep them in sync. Just be aware of that. My third recommendation is about ensuring that you do the necessary preparation work to end up with an actionable product roadmap, an actionable plan. So what we want is a realistic product roadmap that's reliable as it can be. Acknowledging that in an agile space things do change and we will have to adjust the roadmap. I don't think that should be a serious question. But at the same time, if the roadmap changes willy-nilly, I mean, if it literally changes every other week, then the stakeholders are unlikely to use it. It's just no longer a reliable plan. It's no longer a useful and meaningful plan. So what can we do to have an actionable, realistic roadmap? Well, for me, a key prerequisite is to have a validated product strategy in place. What do I mean by a validated product strategy? Well, a product strategy for me describes the value that the product creates for the users and customers, the main problem that the product should solve or address, or the primary benefit that it should create. So why would anybody bother using the product or purchasing the product, paying for it? Why would people use it? And then, the second element in a product strategy would be, who are those people? Who are the beneficiaries? Who are the users and customers? Who is part of the market that we want to address and who isn't? Who's part of the target group and who isn't? The third element will be what makes the product stand out and different from the competition, from competing offerings. How do we differentiate ourselves? And finally, what are the business goals? What are the desired business benefits that the product should provide? Should the product generate revenue, directly or indirectly? A product that generates revenue directly, like Microsoft Office, which is the product I'm using right now in order to share the slides with you. That will be a revenue generating product. Or should it generate revenue indirectly? Take the Kindle app, for instance. You don't pay for the Kindle app, but you pay for downloading Kindle books. And this is then how monetization happens. Or if you take an IT product, an IT app, an IT solution, then the benefit to the company typically is to reduce cost and increase productivity. So I think those questions we should really ask, and we should be able to answer in a confident and meaningful way before we build a product roadmap. And that's what I mean by validated. Validated means that we've de-risked our strategy, that there are no major risks left in our product strategy, and that we're confident that we've nailed the value proposition, the market, the differentiators, and the business goals. And then the roadmap really adds additional detail. And when we compare this with the holiday example from earlier on, then finding a valid strategy is like figuring out what is the best way to get to our holiday destination. Should we drive? Should we fly? Should we take the train? Or be more ambitious and cycle, or possibly even walk? Maybe then an extended holiday, a sabbatical that we have to take. But those are all options. So which option is the most attractive one? Which is the option that makes most sense, that is truly valid? If we haven't figured out that, or if we're not pretty confident that driving to southern France makes sense, I certainly wouldn't bother looking into times when the ferry leaves, and I wouldn't start now looking into booking a hotel. Doesn't make any sense. Again, same thing with your product roadmap. Be clear on the overarching strategy before you then describe the journey of your product. Good. The next suggestion is about how you create the product roadmap, and to a certain extent also how you update it and adjust it. And what I'd really like to encourage you is to take a collaborative approach. I find that works very well in an Agile space and resides very nicely with other Agile practices, and B, it leads to stronger product roadmaps and to a better buy-in. Now, sometimes figuring out who the right people are, the right stakeholders are to involve in the product roadmapping activities can be tricky, particularly when you work for a large organization and there are many different stakeholders. So using a little tool that allows you to analyze and group the stakeholders can be very helpful. And here you see a little tool that's called the Power Interest Grid. And it really classifies stakeholders, puts them into 4 groups, depending on the interest that they have and the power, the influence that people hold. So people typically have an interest in your product when they're affected by the product in one way or the other. And they have power or influence over the product if they can either block or influence a product decision, or if they have to contribute to the product success, help make the product successful. So people with low interest and low power are referred to as the crowd. If you develop a commercial digital product, then maybe HR or maybe finance, it could be a member of the crowd. Those are people that probably don't have a massive interest in your product roadmap. People who have a high interest but low power are called subjects. I'm a subject with regards to the Microsoft Office products that I use. I have an interest, but I don't really have much power to influence product decisions. High power and low interest are referred to as context setters, and these are often senior people in the organization, executives. And those people who have a high interest and high power, for instance, the development team members or marketing and sales, maybe support for a commercial product, those would be the players. And those would be the people that I suggest you regularly involve in road mapping activities, and you invite to create an initial product roadmap, and then invite them back to review and update the roadmap together with you. Now, what that does is it leverages the collective creativity and knowledge of those people. It allows them to help you shape the roadmap and the product strategy, and that typically leads to better decisions and to a stronger buy-in. There's no point if you create a beautiful roadmap, but the players, the key stakeholders, look at it and say like, yeah, nice, but completely unrealistic. No way we can help with this. No way we can contribute to this. Or the development team says, no way we can deliver this. So I think it's really, really helpful. It's really important to get that buy-in, make sure that the roadmap is realistic, and that people look at it as a helpful, actionable plan. But do not forget, please, that a collaborative approach does require leadership, and that you have to think about how you reach consensus and what you do if no consensus can be reached. And I would suggest that if the latter is the case, if you can't reach agreement, then you as the person in charge of the product should make a decision, and you should not be afraid to do so. And that moves us on to the next topic, if you want. So the next tip, the next suggestion, be clear on who owns the product roadmap and decide it. Understand who owns the product roadmap. So we just talked about the different stakeholders and players. As the product manager, product owner, you'd be a stakeholder, a key stakeholder, a player. And then, then we've got the development team, as I've mentioned, maybe somebody from marketing, a sales rep, maybe a product manager, product owner from a related product. Maybe that's a player, or maybe that's somebody who belongs to the subjects, the group of subjects. Service and support, management, sponsor, and even users and customers have an interest in the roadmap if you use an external roadmap. So potentially there are lots of people, a diverse group of people who have an interest in the roadmap, who want to influence it, who want to work with it. In order to avoid that your product roadmap is just a collection of weak compromises, and you agree on the smallest common denominator, I do think that strong product leadership and ownership is important. And for me, the product manager, product owner, the person in charge of the product should also ultimately own the roadmap. So it's about striking this balance between clear ownership and saying, I own the roadmap. In a way, it's my product, it's my roadmap, but at the same time, being open to the ideas and suggestions of the others, particularly the players, and actively involving them to help you shape the roadmap, and taking their ideas and their suggestions in account as good as you can, but staying true to your vision and staying true to the overarching strategy that you've agreed upon and validated, to avoid that, again, your product is just made up of weak compromises and essentially becomes like a feature soup, a collection of different features depending on who shouts the loudest and has the biggest clout. I know this is sometimes easier said than done, but still think it's important to have the product manager, product owner, the person in charge of the product steer and guide the rate of change in the product backlog, and that allows you then to come up with a cost figure. And that can be a very lengthy, a very complicated, a very difficult process that doesn't necessarily come up with a correct figure. It may come up with a precise figure, but it's not necessarily the correct one. The alternative, which I personally prefer, is a much simpler, faster approach, and it's about, as it says here, determining the cost top-down. So you basically start with your initial product roadmap and then ask the development team, well guys, how many people with which skills will be ideally needs to deliver all those releases with their goals and features in the time frame stated, or at the date stated. And if you can't add any new people or extra people to the development team, then I'd ask the development team, are you confident that you can deliver those releases? And this should give you a rough estimate, a ballpark figure, and it's really just about a very rough estimate that allows the person who is in charge of making a go or no-go decision to understand what is the financial risk associated with this product roadmap. And the individual can weigh it up against the benefits, the potential benefits that the product will deliver over the coming months. And a wise person once said, it's better to be roughly right than to be precisely wrong. So that's the attitude I would suggest you adopt here. Come up with a rough ballpark figure, a range, and say, how much roughly is this? And if that figure is unacceptable, if it's too high, or if people with the right skills simply aren't available, well, then you have two choices. You can either adjust your roadmap and, for instance, weaken some of those goals, relax some of those dates, or if you say that doesn't make any sense, then maybe there's something wrong with your overarching strategy and you have to adjust your strategy, which means you may have to pivot. So you may have to look into the problem that your product addresses, or who the users and customers are, and make the appropriate changes. So hopefully this process, as I mentioned earlier, should be fairly quick and fairly easy, and give you a good enough initial estimate to make a go or no-go decision. When you then develop your releases, I would use the empirical tools that your process gives you. So if you use Scrum, then use the release burndown chart to understand if the date and budget constraints that you've set yourselves are realistic and can be met. Or if you use Kanban, use a cumulative workflow diagram. Use a cumulative workflow diagram, yes. I think that's what it's called. So measure the actual progress and compare it to your initial estimate. Good. And now for my last suggestion, regularly review the product roadmap. Now, it'd be a mistake to say, once we've done the roadmap, once we've sorted out the strategy, it's all about execution. That can work when there is very little or no change, but in an agile space, we do expect that things change unexpectedly. There's a fair amount of uncertainty and risk present. That means we have to adjust the roadmap. The only question then is how often should you review and adjust the roadmap? And in order to decide which frequency is right for you, I suggest you look at two dimensions. The maturity of your product, how mature, how stable is your product, and how stable is the market, or how dynamic is it. So if you have a young product, a brand new product, a product that's in the introduction stage that you've just released, I would suggest you may want to review the product roadmap on a monthly basis, so fairly frequently. And if you have a monthly review cadence, then you may want to consider aligning those product roadmap reviews with your sprint reviews or your bigger Kanban meetings. So if you have an operations meeting or something similar, a monthly meeting in a Kanban-based process, then that may be a good opportunity to also look at the product roadmap and make any adjustments. In those meetings, you should have the key stakeholders, the players present anyway, so the right people are there. Might as well look at the roadmap. If there's more stability, so if the product is mature or the market is stable, then quarterly reviews are typically appropriate in my experience. And that'd be my default. So if you're not quite sure, then I'd say, well, start with quarterly reviews and see how that goes and adjust. And if there's more stabilities, which means you have a mature product and the market is pretty stable, then you can get away with reviewing the product roadmap every 6 months or so. And again, I'd encourage you to invite the key stakeholders, the players, and follow a collaborative approach. And that's it really. This is everything I've got prepared. And hopefully, when we do the product road mapping right, we'll get to our destination. In our case, going back to the analogy of a road trip, it'd be the beach. So I very much look forward to your questions now. Thank you for listening to me. For those of you who don't feel comfortable joining in the chat now or want to contact me offline, you can find more information on my website, and you can always reach out to me via email, Twitter, and other social media. And this is just a shameless plug. A few months ago, I launched a new book called Strategize, and that talks about product road mapping and generally product strategy practices in more detail. So thank you very much, and let's have a look now at your questions. So I can't see many questions at the moment. So does anybody have any questions? You're all road mapped out now. Oh, I see, a translation is coming. Yes, you have to apologize. I don't speak any Portuguese. I should have mentioned that up front. So the question is, how can we use a product roadmap within Kanban? Yeah, great question. Thank you very much. For me, using product roadmaps is independent of the underlying development process, the underlying Agile process. So if it's a Kanban-based process or if it's Scrum, I don't think it matters too much. A product roadmap really encourages you to look ahead and say, well, if we now if we now consider the next 12 months or so, what are some major benefits that our product should deliver? What are some major milestones that we'd like to achieve? And I think that's true no matter what process you use. It's also true and helpful no matter where your product is in its life cycle. So Kanban is sometimes used to develop mature products where you have a lot of maintenance work, bug fixing work, where you focus on making smaller incremental enhancements and optimize existing features. So you've got small tickets, small work items that need to be done, maybe some high priority bugs that take preference and have a lot of urgency. But still, I think it'd be worthwhile to say, okay, for the next 2 or 3 months, generally, is there any goal that we'd like to achieve, any benefit? Maybe it's about fixing certain bugs and creating some stability, at least in part of the product. or maybe it's about optimizing some of the features. So ask yourself, where do you want to take your product from now, and what are some benefits that you'd like to deliver over the next 6, 9, 12 months? And then the next question, I think, is how to make high-level estimates in when we create the product roadmap. What are the options? Well, I would suggest that you consider how many people do you believe are required in order to deliver the benefits stated on your roadmap, and implement those features, provide those deliverables, and which skills should they have. And assuming that labor is the decisive cost factor in software development, that should give you a rough budget. But you may have to add other cost items to it for the environment and infrastructure, renting the rooms or hiring rooms, for instance. But labor, as I said, usually really is the key cost factor. So that should give you a good idea, how much, what budget you may need, how much money we're roughly talking about. So I wouldn't really go down and start estimating product backlog items or features on the roadmap. I personally think that's premature. If you feel confident that you can do this, then that's cool, that's great. But then you're no longer in a dynamic environment, and then you're no longer in an agile, complex environment with a lot of change and a lot of risk and uncertainty. And then you may not benefit tremendously from goal-oriented roadmaps. You might still be able to use them, but then more traditional feature-based roadmaps might be good enough. So hopefully that answers the question. The next question says, do you suggest any metrics to follow up the product roadmap? The metrics, so if you include metrics on your product roadmap as I suggested, then you should select the metrics depending on your release goals. So look at the release goal and say, how can we check, how can we understand if we've met the goal or not? So for instance, if the goal is around reducing technical debt and future-proofing your product, and maybe some of you remember, by the way, quite a few years ago, Apple released Snow Leopard. And Snow Leopard essentially was one big gigantic maintenance release as far as I'm concerned. They really spent nearly 2 years porting their operating system to new Intel hardware, cutting out bad code, simplifying the code, and changing some of the underlying libraries. That was I'd say probably a long release with the goal of simplifying the product, simplifying the code base, and removing some technical debt, I guess. Certainly future-proofing the product. So then it'd be useful. To say, how do we know that we've achieved our goal? How do we know that we've now removed technical debt? In which area do we want to remove the technical debt? And to which extent? And to think about something like a complexity metric that you want to use, or think about a refactoring threshold that you want to set yourself. A target that you need to achieve. So it really goes back to making sure that the goal is not just a hairy-fairy, intentional, ambitious goal. That's cool when you work with a vision. I mean, the vision should be big, it should be ambitious, and I feel a vision shouldn't be measurable. But a goal on the product roadmap, a release goal, should very much be, definitely be measurable. It should be specific. And by choosing the right metrics, the right success criteria, those criteria help you ensuring that your goal is indeed measurable. So I hope that answers the question. If I didn't manage to answer your question, by the way, then please just ask it again. So I'm just checking the chat stream. Oh yes, and a new question's coming in. That's a great one. Generally, all your questions have been great, and thanks for asking them. Thanks for sharing your questions. I certainly appreciate it. So how do you have any suggestions? That's what the question asks. Do you have any suggestions? How about how to start a product roadmap if I only have a product backlog? Yeah, that's a very good question. And so for me, in order to create a meaningful product roadmap, I wouldn't necessarily now try and reverse engineer it from the product backlog. I mean, that'd be the first option that you have, that you look at your product backlog and you say, okay, maybe there's some higher level themes and sort of key deliverables that I can distill out and that I can now assign to a timeline. But then essentially what you're creating is a feature-based roadmap, and that can work if your product is mature, if the product is stable and the market is fairly stable as well. But if you're working on a new product, either a brand new product or a young product, a product that maybe hasn't achieved product market fit or has just achieved product market fit, where there's still a lot of things are changing, then I don't think that'd be appropriate. Then I'd step back and I'd ask myself, do we have an overarching strategy? So again, do we know what the value proposition of our product is? Do we understand the main problem that it should address or solve, or the primary benefit it should provide? Who the users and customers are, what makes the product stand out, and what the business goals are. And really write this down, and ideally do it together with the players, the key stakeholders, and see how much agreement there is, or maybe how much disagreement there is, and how certain you are that you've answered those questions correctly. And then based on that high level strategy, create a product roadmap. So for me, the product roadmap should be derived from a validated high level strategy. That'd be the input for the product roadmap. And then the product roadmap drives the product backlog. Now, if you adopt this top-down approach, it may turn out that your current product backlog is no longer valid, and you essentially have to discard it, or you have to delete a large amount of its contents. But for me, that'd be okay. For me, it's more important to understand why we're building the product and who we're building it for in the first place, and how roughly will create value for the users and for the business, rather than having lots of detailed items in my product backlog. Yeah. So if the backlog and the overarching strategy don't fit together, one of those has to go, and I'd rather throw away the backlog than the overarching strategy. So I hope that answers the question. So there's a new question, thank you. I have realized that in this year many companies have more concerns about boosting PM's role. What will be the next trends in product management in your vision? So PM, I just interpret or read PM as product management. I'd share your observation. I think more companies start to understand that product management plays a key role in ensuring that successful products are created, or products achieve their targets and create enough value for the users and for the business. Many companies, I find, and in many industries, traditionally product management didn't play a role. Think about insurances, banks, think about retailers, think about media companies and publishers. Traditionally, those companies didn't have any product management groups. So I think more and more of those companies are investing in educating product managers and recognizing that full-time professional product people are beneficial and certainly necessary in order to have successful digital products. So I think a lot of the need for investing in product management has come from the rise of digital products, really. Now, in terms of trends, I don't know if my knowledge of the market is really representative enough, but certainly for me, I think we have a lot of good, solid tactical practices in the product management community. Things around how do we capture requirements, what are user stories, what are user story maps, how can we describe the user experience, how can we describe the user journey. I think we've got a lot of what are personas, how can we use personas. I think so we've got a lot of very solid, more tactical practices. And for me, helping product people embrace some of the more strategic aspects and consolidating their knowledge in that space is very important. Because if we focus too much on the details, which I think to a certain extent is natural when we work particularly with digital products that require a lot of attention to the details, but if we focus too much on the details, then in the worst case we just get the overarching strategy wrong, and we go down the wrong path, and in the worst case end up in the wrong forest. Or even if we're in the right forest, we no longer see the wood for the trees because we're standing too close to the trees. So for me, product strategy, it plays a big part, and not only in terms of being able then to make the right tactical decisions, but also in order to be an effective product person. I find that often product people, the product managers, product owners, are authorized to make the tactical decisions and write user stories and decide on the detailed functionality, but quite often they're not really respected or empowered in order to make the strategic decisions. And for me, the two things belong together. I think product people should own the strategic and the tactical parts of or aspects of their products. So that was a lengthy answer. Apologies if it was too long. So there are two new questions, which is great. Business model canvas versus lean canvas. Do you recommend those for specific approaches? Well, the business model canvas and the lean canvas are great tools. Business model canvas was created by Alexander Osterwalder and Yves Pigneur. Lean canvas is based on the business model canvas created by Ash Moria. So my preference would be to use the lean canvas when you develop a product, because I feel it's a little bit more product specific, it has a stronger product focus than the business model canvas. And particularly if you develop a brand new product, possibly in a startup environment, or where you need to develop the business model together with your product. So sometimes you develop a brand new product and the business model already exists. So take for instance iTunes. iTunes was developed in order to make an existing business model work. Apple was selling iPods, but not very successfully. And by providing iTunes and making it legal and convenient and comparatively cheap to buy digital music, that helped Apple sell their iPods and later their iPhones. And sometimes, as in the case of Facebook, you could say, or Twitter, the product comes first, and then you have to look for a business model in order to monetize the product and make the development of the product sustainable. So in those kind of cases, you really do need to look at the business model. And if you focus on a specific product, I'd use the lean canvas. If you generally want to review how your business generates revenue and profits, and how you can innovate the business model and use that in order to look into providing new products and services, then I'd have a preference to use the business model canvas. With both canvases, what I'd say is they're great tools, but they all have a number of boxes, 8 or 9, I think, about. And so you don't be tempted to fill out all those boxes and focus on what counts first. I mean, every business model is really built on a strong value proposition. So you really need to figure out what value do you want to create for the users and customers, and who are those people, before you can then think about how you monetize it. So just watch out for that. And then the next question says, if I'm in a large scale environment with 8 Scrum teams, how can I manage my roadmap? Do you have any suggestions? Yes, the first one is to say, how many products do those 8 teams develop? If it's one product, well, then you should have one product backlog and one product roadmap. If those 8 teams develop several products, then you may want to employ several product roadmaps or one overarching portfolio roadmap if those products are closely related. For instance, if I was in charge of Microsoft Office, I'd probably be tempted to work with one overarching roadmap for the entire Office suite, as I feel that those products are fairly closely related. I mean, they're released, major updates are released at the same time, and they're monetized as a bundle, as a package. Yeah. So the question is, how many products do you develop? If it's one product roadmap. Of course, the more teams you have, the more people are involved in the development process, the more work it becomes to make sure that any plan that you create is an agreed plan and is a sustainable plan. So, instead of involving all the 8 development teams, involve representatives from the teams in the road mapping sessions. That'd be my recommendation. And a new question: what do you recommend to a junior product owner? What do I recommend to junior product owners? So generally, as product people, I think we have a challenging job. I really do think so. I think our job requires a diverse set of skills. It's very multifaceted. We need to be able to interact with users and customers. We need to be able to interact with the development team. We need to be able to talk to management. We need to be able to work with marketing, sales, and other internal business, internal stakeholders and business units. That's tricky. That's challenging. It really does require a lot. So we all have different backgrounds because there's, as far as I know, there is no standardized way how to become a product owner or product manager. So people typically are thrown into the job. So whenever you're thrown into the job, then simply look at the skills that you currently have and the skills that you think you need in order to do a successful job as a product owner or product manager. In generally, I look at 3 key skills areas. I think competent product people require the necessary tactical skills to make the right product decisions. So that's around product backlog management, user stories, for instance, personas, workflow diagrams, things like validating ideas for new features or feature optimizations, techniques like A/B releases or usability tests, for instance. But also, I think as a product owner, product manager, I mentioned it earlier, at least over time you should acquire the key strategic practices that are helpful for your work, such as working with a product roadmap and maybe knowing about different roadmap types, describing and validating an overarching high-level product strategy, shaping a strong vision, an inspiring vision for your product. But those are in a way more the hard skills, you could say. The soft skills, the leadership skills are equally important for product people, being able to communicate effectively with various people, being able to lead people, being able to, being aware of your own leadership preferences, the leadership styles that you tend to gravitate towards, that you default towards. And using the right leadership styles in a mindful way. Generally, I find mindfulness a very important practice for product people, so we can effectively reflect on how we work and how we do things and improve. So those soft skills are equally important, and those are the 3 areas that I'd look at and say, how do I do? How strong am I, and which of those skills should I improve in order to get better at my job? And one of the tools that you can use in order to do that is a little web app on my website called the Product Management Test, which essentially allows you to assess your product management knowledge and then highlights areas where you have strengths and weaknesses, and you can then use that to decide if and how you want to improve those areas. And then a new question that says, what do you feel will be the trend in the next 5 years in product development? I don't know. I wish I knew, but I don't have a crystal ball. I do have to say, though, that while I personally greatly appreciate the benefits that digital products have brought to me in my life. I mean, I couldn't go back. I mean, as a family, we do so much shopping online these days, and I couldn't imagine stepping back 15, 20 years in time and having to do all the shopping on a Saturday, rushing around in town and fighting for a pair of shoes or I don't know, a piece of bread. Not quite that bad, but I wouldn't want to go back. However, I also feel that there are lots of digital products out there that just don't add a tremendous amount of value or aren't necessarily ethical. And so I really do hope that a trend in product management is reflecting on what makes products truly beneficial. And what about the ethical side of the digital products that we're creating? And it's not just that people use or misuse certain social media products to only read the news that they want to read. I think there's a bigger issue really. Why do we create products? Is it purely to make as much money as possible, as quickly as possible, or is it because we believe that, as I said, they really create some value for someone, for some users? So that'd be a nice trend. That'd be a trend I'd like to see. So I think we have maybe time for one more question. And here it is. How can you manage marketing in the product roadmap? I guess how can marketing contribute to the product roadmap? I mean, that'd be maybe a question to answer. I would suggest that you involve somebody from the marketing group, a marketeer, in the road mapping activities, in creating and updating the product roadmap. And I generally find it very helpful if there is a representative from the key business groups that works with you on a continued basis. So a specific individual from marketing, and a specific individual from sales, and a specific individual from support, who acts in a way as the marketing, sales and support ambassador or representative, and as I said, is involved with the product on a continued basis. So I think that's something really beneficial. So those individuals build up the knowledge, they understand the context, and you can also establish a good working relationship with those guys. So yes, do involve them in the product roadmap. There's an example from a client of mine where developments optimized their work, and through the application of agile practices and some changes, it really started to push out new releases very quick, and product management changed and adapted, and together they were really creating more products and more releases, until marketing said to them, guys, stop it. We can't support all those products and releases. That just goes to show that sometimes marketing actually can become the constraint. And of course, there's no point creating releases if those releases can't be supported adequately by marketing and sales. So if they can be marketed and sold effectively. So it's important to have marketing involved in creating and updating the roadmaps, and make sure that the marketeer or the marketeers, generally the marketing group, is on board and happy with where you're taking your product, and that marketing buys into the product roadmap. And I think that's it. I've now consumed my time. So thank you very much for those of you who were listening, and thank you very much for those of you who may be watching this video afterwards. I hope it was a little bit helpful and beneficial for you, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.